Miss Marple and the Death at the Spring Flower Show, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where we unravel mysteries as intricate as the patterns in a Persian rug. I'm your host Connor, and tonight we step into the carefully tended gardens of St. Mary Mead, where spring blooms hide deadly secrets. Before we begin, I'd love to know, are you listening from a garden, a cosy armchair, or perhaps somewhere entirely unexpected? Share your location in the comments below. Now, settle in with your favourite beverage, and let us begin this tale of beauty, betrayal, and murder most horticultural. Chapter 1. Roses and Rivalries. The last Saturday of April arrived in St. Mary Mead with that particular crystalline quality that makes English spring so celebrated in verse and memory. Miss Jane Marple adjusted the wide brim of her gardening hat and surveyed the exhibition tent with satisfaction. The Spring Flower Show, that venerable institution which had graced the village calendar for 73 years, stood in full splendour across the church meadow. Rows of trestle tables bore the fruits of winter's planning and spring's labour. Dahlias like pom-poms of jewelled silk, roses that would make the Chelsea Flower Show judges weep with envy, and vegetables of such improbable size and perfection that one suspected divine intervention or, more prosaically, chemical enhancement. Miss Marple's own entry, 3 stems of her late Aunt Fanny's heirloom roses, occupied a modest corner of the competition table. The blooms were lovely, she had to admit, with that particular shade of cream touched with the faintest blush of pink that her aunt had spent 40 years perfecting through careful cultivation. She had no grand expectations of winning. Entering was more a matter of honouring her aunt's memory than pursuing glory. Besides, everyone knew that the blue ribbons at St. Mary Mead's Spring Flower Show followed certain predictable patterns that had less to do with horticultural excellence than with social standing, and, if village gossip was to be believed, financial arrangements. The man responsible for judging this year's entries had just entered through the tent's main opening, and Miss Marple observed him with the quiet interest she habitually applied to her fellow humans. Sir Edmund Wickham was a tall, angular gentleman of perhaps 65 years, with the sort of aristocratic features that looked as though they had been carved rather than grown. His reputation as a horticulturist was formidable. He had written 3 books on English garden roses, served on the Royal Horticultural Society's council, and maintained gardens at his Berkshire estate that were featured regularly in country life. His presence as head judge was considered quite a coup for St. Mary Mead. Yet there was something in Sir Edmund's manner today that struck Miss Marple as peculiar. As he moved between the exhibition tables, examining each entry with methodical attention, his weathered face bore an expression of discomfort that seemed inconsistent with the pleasant task before him. His hands, she noticed, trembled slightly as he made notes on his clipboard, and twice she observed him pause to press his fingers against his temples as though suffering from a headache or perhaps a troubled conscience. The other exhibitors moved about the tent with varying degrees of anxiety and anticipation. Mrs. Gerald Bantry, resplendent in a lavender ensemble that matched her prize sweet peas, was holding court near the vegetable section, loudly expressing confidence in her husband's marrow, which was indeed of impressive dimensions. Colonel Melchett's wife stood guard over her dahlia entry with the vigilance of a sentry protecting state secrets. Young Timothy Grant, the village schoolmaster, hovered near his display of native wildflowers with the nervous energy of someone who had invested considerable hope in an uncertain outcome. But it was 3 particular individuals who drew Miss Marple's most careful attention. Mrs. Constance Hartley, widow of a wealthy industrialist, had entered what appeared to be a professionally arranged floral display that belonged more properly in a 5-star hotel lobby than a village competition. Mr. James Thornfield, who had made his fortune in property development, stood beside an exhibition of hybrid tea roses that looked suspiciously like they had been purchased rather than grown. Miss Dorothy Pemberton, the flower show secretary, moved efficiently between tables with her clipboard, her plain features set in lines of concentration as she ensured every detail met the exacting standards she had maintained for 20 years. As the afternoon progressed and the judging continued, Miss Marple found herself drawn into conversation with Miss Pemberton. The secretary's devotion to the flower show was evident in every word she spoke, discussing the event with the passionate intensity some people reserved for religion or politics. She mentioned Sir Edmund's name frequently, always with a reverence that seemed to go beyond professional respect. Miss Marple filed this observation away, as she did so many small human details, in the capacious mental archive that had proven useful on previous occasions when village tranquillity had been disrupted by darker matters. The judging concluded at 5:30, and Sir Edmund retired to the committee tent to finalise his decisions. The award ceremony was scheduled for 7 o'clock, giving exhibitors time to return home and change into more formal attire. Miss Marple decided to take a brief walk through the village before returning, her practical mind already planning the casserole she would prepare for Sunday lunch. The spring evening was growing cool, and she pulled her cardigan more closely about her shoulders as she made her way past the exhibition tent one final time. Through the canvas walls she could hear voices raised in what sounded like urgent conversation. She recognised Sir Edmund's cultivated tones and Miss Pemberton's more tentative replies, though the words themselves were indistinct. Chapter 2. Death Among the Dahlias. Miss Marple returned to the church meadow at 6:15, earlier than strictly necessary, but prompted by that indefinable instinct that had served her well over the years. The exhibition tent stood quiet in the golden evening light, its white canvas glowing against the darkening trees beyond. Most exhibitors had departed to change for the ceremony, and the few remaining volunteers were occupied with arranging chairs for the anticipated audience. The secretary's tent, where Sir Edmund had been working on his final judging notes, showed no signs of activity. It was Mrs. Bantry who made the discovery, returning early to ensure her sweet peas were still perfectly positioned. Her scream carried clearly across the meadow, causing heads to turn throughout the village. Miss Marple, who had been examining a bed of early primroses near the tent entrance, immediately made her way toward the sound with a speed that belied her years. She arrived to find Mrs. Bantry standing rigid with shock in the entrance to the secretary's tent, one hand pressed against her mouth. Sir Edmund Wickham lay slumped in his chair before a folding table covered with exhibition catalogues and judging forms. A champagne flute rested near his right hand, its contents partially consumed. His face had taken on a peculiar colour that even in the dimming light struck Miss Marple as distinctly wrong. His eyes were open but unseeing, and there was no doubt whatsoever that he was beyond any earthly assistance. The table before him was in considerable disarray, with papers scattered and his clipboard lying face down on the grass floor. Miss Marple's first action was to prevent Mrs. Bantry from entering the tent further or touching anything. Her second was to dispatch young Timothy Grant, who had come running at the sound of Mrs. Bantry's distress, to telephone for Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack. Her third action, conducted with the quiet efficiency that characterised her methods, was to observe everything about the scene with meticulous attention. The champagne bottle on the table was 3/4 empty. A single flute stood beside it, the one from which Sir Edmund had evidently been drinking. The liquid remaining in the glass had a faint cloudiness that might have been sediment, but struck Miss Marple's experienced eye as potentially more sinister. The judging notes were missing. Sir Edmund's clipboard, when she carefully turned it over with the tip of her walking stick, bore only the title page of his evaluation forms. The actual pages containing his decisions had been removed. More curiously, when Miss Marple glanced through the tent's opening toward the exhibition tables in the main tent, she could see that something was terribly wrong with several of the entries. Mrs. Bantry's sweet peas, which had been pristine earlier, now showed signs of wilting and discoloration. Colonel Melchett's wife's dahlias appeared similarly affected. At least 4 other exhibits bore the unmistakable signs of having been deliberately damaged. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand and his round face grave with professional concern. He conducted a brief examination of Sir Edmund while Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry waited outside the tent, the latter still trembling from shock. When the doctor emerged, his expression confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected from observing the deceased's symptoms. "Poison," he said quietly to Miss Marple, knowing from past experience that she could be trusted with such information. "I'd stake my reputation on it. The pallor, the apparent cardiovascular collapse, the rapidity of death. I'll need to conduct a proper examination, of course, but if I had to guess, I'd say digitalis. Foxglove extract, most likely. Nasty stuff when taken in quantity. Causes the heart to simply stop." Inspector Slack arrived shortly thereafter, his sturdy frame and sceptical expression familiar to everyone in St. Mary Mead who had witnessed his previous investigations. He cleared the tent area with brusque efficiency and began questioning those who had remained on the meadow. Miss Marple, observing from a respectful distance, noted several things that the inspector's more direct approach might miss. Miss Pemberton had appeared at the sound of the commotion, her plain face stricken with what appeared to be genuine horror. Yet there was something in her movements, a certain guilty furtiveness, that Miss Marple found interesting. The secretary kept glancing toward the damaged exhibits in the main tent, her hands twisting the fabric of her sensible cardigan. "This is most irregular," Colonel Melchett pronounced, having appointed himself spokesman for the shocked exhibitors. "Sir Edmund was in perfect health just hours ago. Who would want to harm such a distinguished gentleman? And why destroy the competition entries? It makes no sense whatsoever." But to Miss Marple, observing the scene with her characteristic quiet attention, it was beginning to make a certain kind of sense. The pattern of damaged exhibits was not random. Each destroyed entry had won first place in its category, according to the preliminary announcements that had been circulated earlier. Yet Sir Edmund's judging style, from what she had observed during the afternoon, suggested a man who took his responsibilities seriously, who examined each entry with genuine expertise. The destroyed exhibits were exquisite examples of their types, but something about the whole situation suggested that appearances, as so often in Miss Marple's experience, might be deceiving. Chapter 3. The Secretary's devotion. The spring flower show was officially suspended pending police investigation, though the exhibition tent remained standing as a crime scene. Sunday morning found Miss Marple at her customary place in the front pew of St. Mary Mead Church, her prayer book open, but her mind occupied with matters decidedly temporal rather than spiritual. The vicar's sermon on the lilies of the field seemed almost painfully appropriate given recent events, though Miss Marple doubted he had intended such contemporary relevance when planning his homily. After the service, the church vestibule became an impromptu gathering place for discussion of Sir Edmund's death. Mrs. Bantry, having recovered somewhat from her shock, was holding forth on the tragedy with characteristic dramatic flair. Colonel Melchett expressed indignation that anyone should dare commit murder at such a respectable village institution. Young Timothy Grant looked pale and shaken, his natural sensitivity affected by his proximity to violent death. But it was Miss Dorothy Pemberton whose behaviour most interested Miss Marple. The flower show secretary stood apart from the main group, her shoulders hunched as though under a physical burden. She wore black, which was perhaps premature given that the death had occurred less than 24 hours previously, but might be explained by her position as show organiser. When Mrs. Bantry attempted to engage her in conversation, Miss Pemberton responded with monosyllabic replies and quickly excused herself, citing the need to handle administrative matters related to the show's suspension. Miss Marple observed her departure with thoughtful attention, noting the tremor in the woman's hands as she clutched her handbag. That afternoon, having satisfied herself that Inspector Slack was occupied with interviewing Colonel Melchett and other prominent exhibitors, Miss Marple paid a call on Miss Pemberton. The secretary lived in a modest cottage on the edge of the village, its small garden a testament to her horticultural knowledge and dedication. The flower beds were immaculately maintained, with particular attention given to a spectacular collection of foxgloves in various colours. Miss Marple paused to admire these, noting especially a rare variety with apricot-coloured blooms that she had only seen once before, at the Chelsea Flower Show many years ago. Miss Pemberton opened the door with obvious reluctance, her plain face showing signs of sleeplessness. When she recognised Miss Marple, some of the tension left her shoulders, replaced by the resigned acceptance of someone who knows the inevitable must be faced. She invited her visitor into a sitting room that was neat to the point of austerity, decorated primarily with framed photographs of previous flower shows and certificates, recognising Miss Pemberton's service as secretary. "I've been expecting someone to call," Miss Pemberton said quietly, settling into a straight-back chair. "Though I confess I thought it would be Inspector Slack rather than you, Miss Marple. You have a reputation in the village for understanding things that others might miss." Miss Marple accepted tea in a delicate china cup and studied her hostess with sympathetic attention. There was something deeply pathetic about Dorothy Pemberton, she thought, a life devoted to service without recognition, to loving without hope of return, to maintaining standards that no one else seemed to notice or care about. The sitting room's photographs told a story of decades spent organising, arranging, perfecting an event that brought glory to others, while she remained perpetually in the background. "I understand you've been secretary of the Spring Flower Show for 20 years, Miss Marple observed gently. "That's a remarkable record of service. The show has become quite an institution under your management." Miss Pemberton's eyes grew distant. 23 years, actually. I began as assistant secretary in 1930, when I was just 25 years old. Sir Edmund was already serving as a regular judge then. He had such knowledge, such genuine passion for horticulture, not like some judges who simply hand out ribbons to their friends. Her voice carried a bitterness that seemed to surprise her, and she looked down at her teacup with evident discomfort. "It must be difficult," Miss Marple suggested, "to maintain standards when there are so many pressures to compromise them. I imagine judges face considerable lobbying from exhibitors who believe they deserve to win." Miss Pemberton's hands tightened around her teacup. "You have no idea, Miss Marple. The things people will do, the amounts they'll offer, simply to have a blue ribbon pinned to their exhibit, as though the ribbon itself matters more than the achievement it supposedly represents, as though true excellence can be purchased rather than cultivated through patience and care." The conversation continued in this vein for some time, with Miss Marple gently encouraging her hostess to speak about the flower show's operation and Sir Edmund's role in it. What emerged was a picture of systematic corruption that had apparently existed for years, with certain wealthy exhibitors essentially purchasing their prizes through undisclosed payments to the head judge. Miss Pemberton admitted knowing about these arrangements, her voice filled with shame and defensive justification in equal measure. "I tried to stop it," she said, her composure finally cracking. "I begged Edmund, Sir Edmund I mean, to judge honestly, but he said the money was necessary for his estate's upkeep, that his gardening books didn't sell as well as they once had, that it was a victimless arrangement since the exhibitors got their ribbons and he got his fee. He said everyone did it at these provincial shows." Tears began streaming down her plain face, but it wasn't victimless. It made a mockery of everything the show was supposed to represent. It destroyed the meaning of excellence. Miss Marple listened with the compassionate attention of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human weakness in all its forms. She understood now the particular tension she had observed in Sir Edmund on Saturday afternoon, a man planning to break with years of dishonest practice to expose a corruption he had helped create would naturally appear troubled and conflicted. Chapter 4. 5. Who Paid for Glory. Monday morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage, his expression carrying that mixture of grudging respect and defensive irritation that characterized his interactions with her. He settled into her guest chair with the air of a man prepared to be contradicted, but hoping against hope that perhaps this time information would flow in only one direction. Miss Marple poured tea and waited with patient interest for him to reveal what his investigation had uncovered. "Dr. Haydock's examination confirmed digitalis poisoning," the inspector began without preamble. "Foxglove extract, concentrated and mixed into Sir Edmund's champagne. The champagne bottle itself was clean. Someone added the poison directly to his glass. We found traces of the substance around the rim. He would have died within minutes of consuming it, which matches the timeline we've established. The poor devil never had a chance." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "And the missing judging notes? Have they been recovered?" Inspector Slack's expression grew darker. "That's where things get interesting. We found them, or rather a version of them, hidden in Miss Pemberton's desk at the flower show office. But here's the peculiar thing. The notes we recovered show Sir Edmund awarding blue ribbons to exactly the exhibitors who've been winning for years. Mrs. Hartley for her floral arrangement, Mr. Thornfield for his roses, Mrs. Smythe Wilson for her dahlias. The same 5 winners who always seem to triumph, regardless of the quality of their entries." "But surely," Miss Marple suggested mildly, "that seems inconsistent with what we know about Sir Edmund's state of mind on Saturday. If he had been planning to judge honestly for once, as Miss Pemberton suggested to me yesterday, his notes would have reflected different winners." The inspector looked at her sharply. "You've been speaking with Miss Pemberton? I suppose I should have expected that. The woman's been most cooperative, actually. Broke down completely during questioning, and admitted that Sir Edmund had told her on Friday evening about his plans to expose the bribery scheme during his awards ceremony speech. She begged him to reconsider, said it would destroy the show's reputation and her life's work. He refused. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And the 5 exhibitors who had paid for wins they were no longer going to receive? I imagine they all had considerable motive for wanting Sir Edmund silenced. Exactly my thinking, Inspector Slack agreed. We've been investigating their movements on Saturday evening. Mrs. Hartley had access to the tent throughout the afternoon. She was one of the volunteers helping set up chairs. Mr. Thornfield was seen near the secretary's tent around 5:30, said he was looking for Miss Pemberton to discuss a scheduling matter. Mrs. Smythe-Wilson claims she went home at 5, but has no one to verify her whereabouts until she returned for the ceremony at 6:45. The other 2, Mr. Geoffrey Mills and Lady Constance Fairfax, also have rather weak alibis for the crucial period between 5:30 and 6:30. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. Inspector, might I ask what happened to the exhibits that were damaged, the ones that appeared to have been poisoned with weed killer? Ah, now that's another curious element, Slack replied. The damaged exhibits belonged to 7 different people, none of whom were among the usual winners. Young Timothy Grant's wildflowers, for instance, Mrs. Patterson's roses, Colonel Melchett's vegetables. According to our analysis, these were all entries of exceptional quality, the sort that might legitimately have won blue ribbons in an honest competition. Someone deliberately destroyed them after Sir Edmund's death. Which suggests, Miss Marple observed gently, that someone was eliminating evidence of what Sir Edmund's actual judging decisions would have been. If the honest winners' exhibits were destroyed and false judging notes were substituted, showing the bribery participants as winners, it would appear as though nothing unusual had happened. The corruption would continue unchallenged, with no one the wiser about Sir Edmund's planned exposure. Inspector Slack nodded slowly. That's a neat theory, Miss Marple, but it doesn't tell us which of the 5 bribery participants actually committed the murder. They all had identical motives, avoiding exposure and financial loss. We've confirmed that each paid Sir Edmund £500 in January, expecting guaranteed blue ribbons. That's a considerable sum to lose, not to mention the public humiliation if their bribery became known. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at her own modest garden, where spring flowers bloomed with honest beauty unmarred by corruption or pretense. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe you may be looking at this from the wrong direction entirely. Consider the foxglove used to poison Sir Edmund. Dr. Haydock could tell you that different varieties of foxglove have different potencies and different appearances. The poison used on Sir Edmund came from a very specific variety, one that's rather rare in England. She turned from the window to face the inspector directly. The foxglove called Sutton's apricot has distinctive blooms of a pale orange colour, quite different from the common purple varieties. Only 3 gardens in St. Mary Mead grow that particular cultivar. Mine, for one, though I assure you my plants remain intact and unharmed. Mrs. Patterson's garden has some, but she's been in Cornwall visiting her daughter for the past week. And the 3rd garden with Sutton's apricot foxgloves belongs to Miss Dorothy Pemberton. Chapter 5. A Gardening Apron Tells Stories. Inspector Slack departed Miss Marple's cottage with considerably more to think about than he had arrived with. Within the hour he had obtained a warrant to search Miss Pemberton's property more thoroughly than his initial cursory inspection had allowed. Miss Marple, though not officially part of the investigation, found herself invited along, the inspector having learned through experience that her observations often revealed details his own trained eye might miss. They arrived at the secretary's cottage in mid-afternoon, accompanied by Sergeant Lake and a constable, whose primary function appeared to be carrying equipment and taking notes. Miss Pemberton answered the door with the resigned expression of someone who has been expecting precisely this visit. She stood aside without protest, her plain face pale but composed. The small cottage revealed itself to be even more spare than Miss Marple's first impression had suggested. Every surface was clean to the point of sterility. The furniture was functional rather than comfortable. Only the photographs and certificates on the walls provided evidence of passion and personality, a whole life condensed into images of flower shows past. It was in the small scullery at the rear of the cottage that Inspector Slack made his first significant discovery. A gardening apron hung on a peg beside the door to the back garden. The apron was of heavy canvas, well worn but meticulously clean except for certain stains that had evidently proved resistant to laundering. Inspector Slack examined it carefully before calling Miss Marple's attention to the evidence. "Foxglove pollen," he said, pointing to yellowish stains on the apron's front panel. "And here, these darker stains, they appear to be champagne. Dr. Haydock will need to confirm it, but I'd wager this is the apron Miss Pemberton wore while preparing the poison and administering it to Sir Edmund's glass." Miss Pemberton, who had been standing silently in the scullery doorway, made no attempt to deny the accusation. "I wore that apron on Saturday afternoon," she admitted quietly. "I was tidying the exhibition tent, as I always do before a ceremony. I may have brushed against the foxgloves in my garden earlier that morning while checking for aphids. As for champagne, I helped set up the refreshment table in the secretary's tent. Edmund specifically requested champagne to celebrate what he called his return to honest judging." Inspector Slack continued his examination of the cottage, while Miss Marple engaged Miss Pemberton in what appeared to be casual conversation, but was actually a careful exploration of the secretary's state of mind and motivations. They settled in the modest sitting room while the police conducted their search of the upper floor. Through the window, Miss Marple could see Miss Pemberton's garden, its beds of foxgloves swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. The apricot-coloured variety stood out distinctly among the more common purple blooms. "You've created something quite beautiful here," Miss Marple observed gently. "Your garden shows the same dedication and care that you've brought to the flower show over all these years. It must be very difficult to maintain such high standards when others seem content with mediocrity." Miss Pemberton's hands twisted in her lap. "You understand, then? Most people don't. They think I'm just fussy, overly concerned with details that don't matter. But details do matter, Miss Marple. They're the difference between excellence and its mere appearance. They're what separates genuine achievement from purchased recognition." "I imagine it was particularly painful," Miss Marple continued, "to watch Sir Edmund compromise the standards you both valued. A man of his knowledge and reputation, reducing himself to accepting bribes from people who had no genuine appreciation for horticultural excellence. That must have felt like a betrayal of everything you had worked to build." Miss Pemberton's eyes filled with tears. "You have no idea how painful. For 20 years I watched Edmund judge these shows, knowing that half his decisions were based on which exhibitors had paid him the most money. I told myself it didn't matter, that the show itself was what mattered, that as long as the community came together to celebrate spring and beauty, the corruption could be overlooked. But it did matter. It mattered terribly." Inspector Slack returned from upstairs carrying a small leather-bound volume that proved to be Miss Pemberton's diary. He opened it to reveal pages filled with neat handwriting interspersed with pressed flowers, many of them the distinctive apricot-coloured foxglove blooms. The entries dated back several years and documented, in increasingly desperate language, Miss Pemberton's unrequited love for Sir Edmund Wickham and her growing anguish over his systematic dishonesty. "This is quite damning evidence, Miss Pemberton," the inspector said gravely. "Your own words document your feelings for Sir Edmund and your distress over his behaviour. The entry from last Friday evening is particularly revealing." He read aloud. "Edmund has finally decided to be honest, but his honesty will destroy everything we've built. The show, my life's work, all of it will be ruined by his confession. I cannot allow 20 years of dedication to be destroyed by one man's belated conscience. I must find a way to stop him." Miss Pemberton closed her eyes as though in physical pain. "I wrote those words after Edmund refused my pleading. I had gone to his estate on Friday evening, begged him to reconsider his plan to expose the bribery. He was kind but firm. Said his conscience demanded truth, that he couldn't live with himself any longer if he continued the deception. He thanked me for my years of service, but said the show would survive the scandal, might even emerge stronger for it. He didn't. Understand that the show wasn't separate from my life. It was my life." Miss Marple leaned forward with genuine sympathy. "And so you decided to stop him in the only way that seemed available. You prepared the foxglove extract, knowing from your horticultural knowledge exactly how much would be needed to cause death. You brought it to the flower show on Saturday, waiting for your opportunity. When Sir Edmund retired to the secretary's tent with his champagne to finalise his notes, you added the poison to his glass. I didn't plan it, Miss Pemberton protested weakly. Not consciously, not in advance. I had been preparing foxglove extract for weeks, telling myself it was for garden pests. But when I saw Edmund's champagne sitting there, and I knew what he was planning to say during the ceremony, something inside me simply broke. I couldn't let him destroy everything. I just couldn't. Chapter 6. Forged Notes and Altered Truths. The confession, though dramatic, was only partial. Inspector Slack, with Miss Marple's gentle prompting, pressed Miss Pemberton to explain the altered judging notes and the destruction of the honest winner's exhibits. It was in these details that the full scope of the secretary's desperate attempt to preserve her life's work became evident. She had not simply killed Sir Edmund in a moment of passion. She had tried to erase the evidence of his planned honesty and maintain the corrupt system he had intended to expose. After Edmund drank the poisoned champagne, Miss Pemberton explained in a hollow voice, I watched him collapse. I knew immediately what I had done, but I felt no remorse, only a strange sense of relief. He would not expose the bribery, would not destroy the show's reputation, would not make a mockery of all my years of work. But then I realized that his judging notes would reveal everything. He had already completed them, you see, before I entered the tent. They were sitting there on his clipboard, showing that he intended to award blue ribbons to 7 exhibitors who had never won before. She paused, her hands trembling as she recalled the scene. I took the notes from his clipboard and read them. Timothy Grant's Wildflowers, first place in the Native Flora category. Mrs. Patterson's Roses, first place in the Heirloom Variety section. Colonel Melchett's Vegetables, first place for size and quality. All legitimate winners, all people who had never paid Edmund a penny. It was exactly what an honest judging would produce. But it was also evidence that Edmund had changed his pattern, proof that something unusual had happened this year. Miss Marple nodded understandingly. So you destroyed his honest notes and replaced them with false ones, showing the usual winners in their customary positions. You forged his signature to make the substitution seem authentic. But you realized that the exhibits themselves would contradict your false notes. An expert could examine the entries and see immediately that your designated winners were inferior to the exhibits Sir Edmund had actually selected. Exactly, Miss Pemberton whispered. So I took a bottle of concentrated weed killer that we keep for clearing the parking area and systematically poisoned the exhibits that Edmund had actually chosen. It only took a few minutes while everyone was occupied elsewhere. By the time the exhibits were discovered, it would appear that the competition had been marred by vandalism, but Sir Edmund's official notes would show the expected winners. No one would question why the usual people had won their usual prizes. Inspector Slack examined the forged judging notes with renewed interest. The handwriting was indeed Sir Edmund's characteristic script, or at least a very close approximation. But when Miss Marple studied the pages through her magnifying glass, she pointed out subtle differences that revealed the forgery. The pressure of the pen strokes showed hesitation where Sir Edmund's confident hand would have been smooth. Certain letter formations, particularly the capital letters that began each entry's description, showed slight variations from Sir Edmund's natural style. It was excellent forgery, but forgery nonetheless. You've had considerable practice imitating Sir Edmund's handwriting, Miss Marple observed gently. I imagine that, as secretary, you've often had to handle correspondence on his behalf, perhaps even signing routine documents with his authorization. The skill came naturally to you over the years. But forgery under stress, forgery conducted while a man you loved lay dead nearby, that's a different matter entirely. Your usual meticulous control was compromised by emotion. Miss Pemberton nodded miserably. I tried to be careful, tried to make the notes perfect, but my hands were shaking, and I kept thinking about Edmund lying there, about what I had done. I suppose I knew even then that the forgery wouldn't withstand close examination. But I had to try to save something from the disaster, had to try to preserve at least the appearance of normalcy. The full picture was becoming clear now. A woman who had devoted her life to creating beauty and maintaining standards had murdered to protect corruption, driven by a toxic combination of unrequited love and desperation. She had loved Sir Edmund Wickham for 20 years, managing the flower show purely to be near him, tolerating his dishonesty because the alternative was losing the structure that gave her life meaning. When his conscience finally demanded truth, threatening to destroy everything she had built, she had chosen murder over honesty. Inspector Slack rose from his chair with evident satisfaction at having solved the case, though Miss Marple suspected he would have preferred a solution that didn't involve quite so much psychological complexity. "Miss Dorothy Pemberton," he intoned formally, "I am arresting you for the murder of Sir Edmund Wickham. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Miss Pemberton accepted the arrest with the same resigned composure she had shown throughout the interview. As the constable prepared to escort her to the police station, she turned to Miss Marple with an expression of profound sadness. "Do you think badly of me, Miss Marple? Do you think I'm simply wicked?" Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think you're human, Miss Pemberton, capable of love and dedication, but also of terrible mistakes when those qualities are twisted by desperation. You created something beautiful in the flower show, but you also enabled corruption for years because facing the truth was too painful. Sir Edmund finally found the courage to be honest, and you killed him for it. That's tragic rather than simply wicked, but it's still murder." Chapter 7. The Moral Weight of Gardens. The arrest of Miss Dorothy Pemberton sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead of a magnitude comparable to the murder itself. The revelation that the flower show had been corrupted by systematic bribery for years, and that the devoted secretary had committed murder to protect that corruption, challenged fundamental assumptions about trust and appearances that the village had taken for granted. Miss Marple, observing the community's reaction from her customary vantage point of quiet observation, found the aftermath as instructive as the crime itself. The 5 exhibitors who had paid bribes to Sir Edmund Wickham faced immediate social ostracism, despite having committed no crime beyond purchasing what they believed was for sale. Mrs. Constance Hartley left the village entirely, unable to bear the whispered conversations that ceased when she entered shops or church. Mr. James Thornfield resigned from the village council and sold his property, moving to London where his past would not follow him. The other 3 bribery participants withdrew from public life, their social standing irrevocably damaged by association with corruption and murder. It was on a mild afternoon in early May, with spring fully established and the abandoned flower show tent finally being dismantled, that Miss Marple received a visit from young Timothy Grant. The schoolmaster looked considerably older than his years, his sensitive features marked by recent events. He carried with him a small potted plant which he presented to Miss Marple with evident emotion. "It's one of the wild flowers from my exhibit," he explained, "the one that Sir Edmund chose for first place before Miss Pemberton destroyed the others. This plant survived because I had kept it separate as a backup specimen. I thought you might appreciate having it, considering everything you did to uncover the truth." Miss Marple accepted the gift with genuine pleasure, recognizing the delicate blooms of a rare orchid native to English meadows. "How very thoughtful, Mr. Grant. It's quite beautiful. Sir Edmund had excellent judgment in selecting it for recognition. True excellence always reveals itself to those who know how to look." Timothy settled into the chair she offered, his expression troubled. "I've been thinking a great deal about Miss Pemberton, about how someone who seemed so devoted to beauty and standards could commit such a terrible act. It seems almost impossible to reconcile the woman who maintained that flower show with such dedication with the woman who poisoned Sir Edmund and destroyed our exhibits." Miss Marple poured tea and considered her response carefully. "Human beings are capable of holding contradictory qualities simultaneously, Mr. Grant. Miss Pemberton genuinely did love beauty and excellence. Her garden proves that, as does her meticulous care of the flower show over 23 years. But she also loved Sir Edmund Wickham without hope of return, and she had invested so much of her identity in the show that its potential destruction felt like annihilation of her very self." "But to murder someone over a flower show," Timothy protested, "it seems such a trivial cause for taking a human life." "It wasn't trivial to her," Miss Marple replied gently. "To Miss Pemberton, the flower show represented everything she valued: order, beauty, community, and proximity to the man she loved. When Sir Edmund threatened to destroy that, by exposing the corruption she had enabled and tolerated for years, she couldn't see any path forward except through his death. It was terribly wrong, but it wasn't incomprehensible. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching through the window as spring sunshine illuminated Miss Marple's own garden. Finally, Timothy spoke again. "The village council has asked me to help reorganize the flower show for next year. They want to establish new rules, transparent judging, no possibility of corruption. They think a fresh start might redeem what happened, but I'm not sure I can bear to be involved." Chapter 8. Pressed Flowers and Secret Hearts. The trial of Miss Dorothy Pemberton was conducted at the county assizes with considerably less public spectacle than one might have expected for such a sensational case. The defendant's quiet dignity throughout the proceedings, combined with her complete confession and expression of remorse, generated a surprising degree of sympathy despite the calculated nature of her crime. Miss Marple attended several days of testimony, her presence in the public gallery noted by both prosecution and defence. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They presented the physical evidence, the gardening apron with its telltale foxglove pollen and champagne stains, the forged judging notes with their subtle but detectable deviations from Sir Edmund's genuine handwriting, the diary entries documenting Miss Pemberton's unrequited love and growing desperation. Dr. Haydock testified about the digitalis poisoning, explaining how foxglove extract could be prepared from the distinctive Sutton's apricot variety. Inspector Slack described the methodical destruction of the honest winner's exhibits, demonstrating the calculated attempt to conceal Sir Edmund's planned departure from corruption. But it was the defence's presentation of Miss Pemberton's character and circumstances that revealed the full tragedy of the case. Witnesses testified to her decades of selfless service to the community, her genuine devotion to horticultural excellence, and the limited scope of her life beyond the flower show. Her solicitor painted a picture of a woman whose entire identity had become wrapped up in maintaining an institution she believed served the greater good, even as she enabled the corruption that undermined its fundamental purpose. Miss Pemberton herself took the stand and spoke with quiet honesty about her actions. "I have no excuse for what I did," she told the court. "I took a human life to protect something that didn't deserve protection." Sir Edmund Wickham was finally ready to be honest, to restore integrity to something we had both corrupted through years of compromise. "I should have supported his courage rather than killing him for it. I loved him, but my love was selfish and ultimately destructive. I loved the idea of him more than I loved the man himself, because the real Edmund was finally choosing truth over comfort, and I couldn't bear the consequences." The prosecution emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, the weeks spent preparing foxglove extract, the deliberate poisoning, and the calculated attempt to destroy evidence and maintain the corrupt status quo. The defense argued for manslaughter rather than murder, pointing to Miss Pemberton's emotional state and the years of psychological stress that had preceded her terrible decision. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning a verdict of guilty of murder, but with a strong recommendation for mercy. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, acknowledged the complexity of the case. "Miss Pemberton, you have committed the gravest crime recognized by our law. You took a human life with premeditation and calculation. However, the court also recognizes that your crime arose from psychological pressures and emotional circumstances that, while not excusing your actions, provide some context for understanding them. You will serve 15 years imprisonment with the possibility of early release for good behavior." Miss Marple, watching from the gallery as Miss Pemberton was led away, reflected on the strange justice of the outcome. 15 years seemed simultaneously too harsh and too lenient for a crime born of love twisted into something monstrous. As she made her way from the courthouse, she encountered Timothy Grant, who had also attended the sentencing. "She'll be nearly 70 when she's released," he observed quietly. "If she survives that long. Prison will be terribly hard for someone of her sensibilities and age. I find myself feeling sorry for her despite everything she did." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. "Pity and judgment can coexist, Mr. Grant. We can recognize the tragedy of Miss Pemberton's choices while still maintaining that she must face consequences for them. Sir Edmund Wickham deserved the chance to make amends for his years of dishonesty. Miss Pemberton denied him that chance, and in doing so, she destroyed herself as thoroughly as she destroyed him." They walked together through the market town toward the railway station, both lost in contemplation of the case's moral complexities. The spring afternoon was beautiful, with flowers blooming in window boxes and gardens throughout the town, innocent beauty untainted by the human complications that had so recently concluded in the courthouse behind them. Chapter 9. Rebuilding Honest Beauty. 3 months after Miss Pemberton's conviction, St. Mary Mead held its emergency meeting to determine the future of the Spring Flower Show. The gathering took place in the church hall on a warm August evening, with virtually every adult in the village present to voice opinions about whether the institution should be preserved, reformed, or abandoned entirely. Miss Marple attended with her usual quiet interest, sitting near the back where she could observe without seeming to dominate proceedings. Colonel Melchett, as the most senior member of the village council, chaired the meeting with military efficiency. "The question before us tonight is simple," he announced. "Do we want to continue the Spring Flower Show, and if so, under what conditions? The events of April have cast a shadow over what was once our community's most beloved tradition. Some feel that shadow is too dark to dispel." Mrs. Bantry spoke passionately in favour of continuing the show, arguing that abandoning it would mean allowing Miss Pemberton's crime to claim yet another victim. The show itself did nothing wrong, she insisted. It was corrupted by individuals, but the core idea remained sound. We celebrate spring, showcase our gardens, and come together as a community. Those are worthy goals regardless of what happened. Others were less convinced. Mrs. Patterson, whose roses had been poisoned in Miss Pemberton's attempt to destroy evidence, argued that the show had become irredeemably tainted. "Every time I think about entering again, I remember finding my prize roses wilted and dying. I remember discovering that the competition I had trusted for years was nothing but an elaborate fraud. How can we rebuild trust after such betrayal?" Timothy Grant presented a thoughtful compromise that had been developed by a small committee over the previous weeks. The proposal included complete transparency in judging, with all judges selected from outside the village and rotated annually. Financial records would be published quarterly. Judging criteria would be established in advance and made available to all participants. Entry fees would be minimal, ensuring that participation was accessible to everyone, rather than limited to the wealthy. Most importantly, the show would be renamed the Sir Edmund Wickham Memorial Flower Show, acknowledging both his contribution to horticulture and his final attempt to restore honesty. "I believe Sir Edmund would approve," Timothy concluded. "He made terrible mistakes for many years, accepting bribes and compromising his integrity. But in the end, he chose truth over comfort. He paid for that choice with his life, murdered by someone who couldn't bear the consequences of honesty. The best way to honour his memory is to create the kind of show he died trying to establish, one where excellence is genuine and recognition is earned." The debate continued for nearly 2 hours, with passionate arguments on all sides. Miss Marple listened to it all with the attentive interest of someone who understood that communities, like individuals, must struggle with questions of forgiveness and redemption. Finally, Colonel Melchett called for a vote. The result was decisive. The show would continue, reformed according to Timothy's proposals, with its first honest competition scheduled for the following April. As the meeting concluded and villagers dispersed into the summer evening, several people approached Miss Marple to thank her for uncovering the truth. She deflected their gratitude with characteristic modesty, insisting that Inspector Slack had conducted the official investigation and deserved primary credit. But Mrs. Bantry, who knew her friend too well to be fooled, linked arms with her as they walked home through the twilight. "You solved it, Jane, as we all know perfectly well. Without your observations about the foxglove variety and your understanding of Miss Pemberton's state of mind, Inspector Slack might still be investigating the 5 bribery participants. But I've been wondering something. When did you first suspect it was Miss Pemberton rather than one of the exhibitors who had paid for prizes?" Miss Marple considered the question as they walked past gardens where summer roses bloomed with unpurchased beauty. "From quite early on, actually. The pattern of destroyed exhibits troubled me immediately. Why would someone who had paid for a blue ribbon destroy the evidence that would have exposed Sir Edmund's change of heart?" Chapter 10. Spring returns to St. Mary Mead. The following April arrived with that same crystalline quality that had blessed the previous year's tragic flower show. Miss Marple, now 73 years old but with her observational faculties undiminished, prepared her entry for the first Sir Edmund Wickham Memorial Spring Flower Show with a mixture of anticipation and melancholy. Her late Aunt Fanny's heirloom roses had flourished over the past year, perhaps responding to the extra attention she had given them, or perhaps simply following their own mysterious botanical rhythms. The new exhibition tent stood in the same location as its predecessor, but everything else about the event reflected the reforms that had been implemented. 3 judges from the Royal Horticultural Society had been invited to evaluate entries, their credentials impeccable and their independence assured. Timothy Grant, now serving as the show's coordinator, had ensured that every aspect of the competition was documented and transparent. Entry fees had been reduced to nominal amounts, allowing participation from every household in the village regardless of means. Miss Marple arrived early, as was her custom, and observed with satisfaction the diversity of entries that reflected the show's transformation. Young mothers displayed window box gardens they had tended while caring for small children. Elderly pensioners presented vegetables grown in allotment plots. The village school had entered a collective project of native wildflowers that their students had cultivated as an educational exercise. Alongside these modest entries were more ambitious displays from serious horticulturists, but the overall atmosphere was one of genuine celebration rather than anxious competition. The judging proceeded throughout the morning with meticulous attention to established criteria. Miss Marple noticed that several of the previous year's bribery participants had not entered, their absence a lingering consequence of their involvement in the corruption that had led to murder. But new exhibitors had emerged to fill those spaces, people who had previously felt that entering was pointless given the predetermined outcomes. The democratization of the competition had revealed talents that had long been hidden by corruption. At 3 o'clock, Timothy Grant took the podium to announce the results. His voice was steady but emotional as he explained the significance of this moment for St. Mary Mead. A year ago, this community faced a terrible tragedy born of corruption and betrayal. Sir Edmund Wickham died, trying to restore honesty to something that had lost its way. Today we honour his memory by celebrating genuine excellence and authentic achievement. These awards represent real accomplishment, earned through patience, skill, and dedication to beauty. The blue ribbons were distributed to a mixture of expected and surprising winners. Miss Marple's heirloom roses received an honourable mention, which pleased her considerably more than a purchased first place ever could have. Young Timothy Grant's wildflowers, grown from seeds collected from his murdered original entry, won first place in the native flora category. Mrs. Patterson's roses, carefully propagated to replace those destroyed by weed killer, claimed the heirloom variety prize. The vegetable awards went to 3 different allotment holders whose entries showed years of accumulated expertise. But the most moving moment came when Timothy announced a special recognition category that had been created without publicity. The Sir Edmund Wickham Award for Horticultural Integrity, he explained, will be given annually to the exhibitor whose entry best demonstrates the values of patience, authentic skill, and devotion to excellence without regard to recognition or reward. This year's recipient is Miss Jane Marple, whose garden has provided beauty and inspiration to our community for decades, and whose wisdom helped restore truth to our flower show when it had lost its way. Miss Marple accepted the small silver trophy with genuine surprise and emotion. As she stood before the assembled community, holding the award that bore Sir Edmund's name, she found herself thinking about Dorothy Pemberton. The woman was now serving her sentence in a prison far from St. Mary Mead, cut off from the gardens and beauty she had loved. Miss Marple had written to her once, a brief letter expressing hope that she might find peace and forgiveness in time. The reply had been grateful but heartbreaking, filled with regret for choices that could never be unmade. I accept this honour on behalf of all who garden not for glory but for love of growing things, Miss Marple said simply. Gardens teach us patience, humility, and the difference between appearance and substance. They remind us that true beauty cannot be purchased or forged, only cultivated through honest care. May this show always celebrate those values, and may we never forget the cost of compromising them. As the ceremony concluded and the community gathered for tea and conversation, Miss Marple walked one final time through the exhibition tent. The flowers displayed there represented countless hours of patient care, years of accumulated knowledge, and genuine devotion to excellence. They were beautiful not because someone had paid for them to be recognized as such, but because they simply were beautiful, intrinsically and authentically. That, she reflected, was worth preserving, worth fighting for, and worth the difficult work of restoration after betrayal. The spring afternoon stretched golden across the church meadow as St. Mary Mead reclaimed its tradition from the shadow of tragedy, proving that communities, like gardens, could bloom again after even the darkest winter.